Welcome, everyone. My name is Carrie Ost, and I'm happy to be the moderator for today's program. I've been a member here at the Ethical Humanist Society for 7 years, and I am glad to see some new as well as many familiar faces here with us today. A couple notes, please remember to mute your cell phone, and we are having a little trouble with our heat today. If you're getting cold, it's warmer on the second floor. So if at any point you want to pop up there, there's stairs over there or an elevator just out here. Right now I'm not feeling too bad, but do what you need to do. We like to start our programs with a brief thought about humanism. And so I'll share this notion of humanism put forth by the Humanist Society of Western New York, which really resonates with me. Humanists believe that this is the only life of which we have certain knowledge and that we owe it to ourselves and others to make it the best life possible for ourselves and all with whom we share this fragile planet. We also have an opening reading from Deb McGarvey today, so do you want to come up here or there? Okay, go for it. Whatever you want. I don't know what we do.
This is a quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, who's one of my favorite writers. If you deny any affinity with another person or kind of person, if you declare it to be wholly different from yourself, as men have done to women and class has done to class and nation has done to nation, you may hate it or deify it, but in either case you have denied its spiritual equality and its human reality. You have made it into a thing to which the only possible relationship is a power relationship, and thus you have fatally impoverished your own reality.
All right, humanist kids, thank you for joining us for the opening. Have a lovely time. And this morning, our speaker will be Judith Levi. Judith Levi is a retired linguistics professor from Northwestern University who has been actively involved for more than 25 years in award-winning German-Jewish dialogue and reconciliation work. In 2015, the President of Germany awarded her the Cross of the Order Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany for her exceptional achievements in promoting reconciliation between the German and Jewish peoples. In 2016, the book she wrote about her experiences was published in Berlin in German. Its original English title is Reconciliation Odyssey: A Jew Discovers a Different Germany. In 2019, she spoke to us here on the identity paradox, how our multiple identities both divide and unite us. I still remember that talk. Today, she returns to speak on reconciliation and forgiveness, realities, resistance, and rewards. Both of those talks draw on her work during her 15 visits to Germany since 1998, yet both address subjects of universal relevance, far beyond the specific German-Jewish context. Please welcome Judith Levi.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, all of you, for coming today. It's a great pleasure to be back because I had a wonderful time speaking with you before, and you asked great questions. So I look forward to the question period, too. We are, without a doubt, living in a time marked by divisiveness, polarization, and turbulence. A time in which groups that define themselves by contrasting identities, as we just heard in the reading this morning, are fighting, either literally or figuratively, to assert their dominance, their alleged superiority, and their determination to impose their power politically and culturally. To keep perspective, we need to acknowledge that this has happened countless times in societies throughout history. On the other hand, sometimes bitter divisions arise within families or among friends or colleagues, divisions which pull apart those who were once intimately connected. The result can be lasting resentments and enmity, with neither party willing to repair the damage done or even to privately release the painful emotions in their wounded hearts. Down through the ages, 2 remedies have been available for moving beyond the pain and suffering of a difficult past or a divisive present to a more fulfilling and rewarding future. These remedies are reconciliation and forgiveness, the subjects of my talk this morning. In a world as torn by interfaith, interethnic, and interpersonal conflict as is ours, developing a deeper understanding of the nature of reconciliation and forgiveness and how to actually accomplish them is a project from which both we as individuals and our world more broadly can only benefit. As you have been reminded, I have been engaged in German-Jewish dialogue and reconciliation work since 1998. I've written a book about my experiences, but I'm sorry I can't have it for you today, but it's been published only in German so far. And as Carrie mentioned, its title is Reconciliation Odyssey: A Jew Discovers a Different Germany. My talk tonight draws primarily from essential ideas and insights in the final chapter of that book. So let's begin. You know, a few years after my first trip to Germany, I told my tax accountant that I was planning to write a memoir about German-Jewish reconciliation. A Jew himself, he immediately recalled an episode of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson that he'd seen on television 20 years earlier, in which the host, Johnny Carson, was raving about how wonderful his new BMW or Mercedes was. However, Carson's enthusiasm about his German-made car was not shared by his guest, who was the Jewish comedian Alan King. He exclaimed, "I couldn't buy a German car. You, as a non-Jew, may forgive them, but I don't." This anecdote immediately raised a fascinating question for me. Of all the virtues praised and promoted by every religious and moral tradition, what is so different about forgiveness and its close cousin, reconciliation, that people can be so proud of not practicing it that they will brag about their refusal to forgive in front of an audience of millions? Perhaps it's old-fashioned of me, but I can't imagine anyone that I would respect getting on national television to actually brag about refusing to practice, say, kindness or generosity or compassion. But refusing to forgive, that's just fine, it seems. And of course, there are many other contexts besides the German-Jewish one where we know such boasts have been heard down through the ages and to this very day. Some contexts involve persistent conflicts between different religious, political, or ethnic groups. Some are within a single country, such as Syria or Rwanda, or the United States for that matter, and some cross national boundaries. I don't have to name them for you. I'm sure you can think of a long list yourselves. This paradoxical rejection of the virtue of forgiveness was just one of the puzzles I became committed to exploring in the wake of my first trip to Germany in 1998. And so when I wrote my book, I was determined to share not just the events that happened to me on the outside, but also the transformation that they created for me on the inside, my ethical transformation. And that transformation led me to a series of insights about reconciliation and forgiveness that I would like to share with you this morning. We'll be looking at the nature of both reconciliation and forgiveness, what they are and what they are not, what makes them so difficult for us to achieve, what forces can make that easier, and what are some of the rewards that make attaining them so worthwhile in the end. Along the way, I will also compare reconciliation to forgiveness and explain why I see the two as more like cousins than like twins. I plan to take about 50 minutes for my whole talk, so we'll have time for questions at the end. As I've explained, my interest in reconciliation is grounded in my experiences in Germany since 1998. But my interest in forgiveness goes back much further, to my lifelong struggles to overcome the difficulties in my childhood by learning to forgive those who contributed the most to my childhood suffering. To make a very long story as short as I can, I lost my Russian Jewish mother to cancer when I was just 8, and she was just 42. I naturally suffered tremendously from this earthquake in my life, which the surviving adults did not deal with very well. 2 years later, my grieving father married a German Jewish woman. My new stepmother's talent for mothering was near zero, and her controlling, pessimistic, and jealous presence in my life turned out to be very destructive psychologically. So, many years later, I had to learn to forgive my mother for abandoning me through her death, although of course she didn't choose it, to forgive my stepmother for being who she was and not the person I needed her to be, and to forgive my father, both for marrying my stepmother and for not protecting my brother and me from her negative impact. And what do my early family difficulties have to do with my experiences of reconciliation with the German people? It turns out there's a direct causal link. Excuse me. I firmly believe that what I learned about the liberating power of forgiveness in my family context is what motivated me unconsciously but powerfully to seek reconciliation with the German people. And this is because reconciliation, too, is a liberating, healing force for a heart that has been wounded. As we will soon see, forgiveness and reconciliation are not identical, but they do have a lot in common. And I wanted to make clear from the outset that I have been a student of forgiveness even longer than I have been a student of reconciliation. So now let's start off with getting our definitions clear. And we'll start with reconciliation. So, in my dictionary, reconciliation is defined as to reconcile is defined as to reestablish a close relationship between. And if you look in this thesaurus, which is often helpful, we find words like rapprochement, resolution, making up, patching up, harmonizing, you can read the rest, making peace with, healing the breach. I like the word rapprochement because it means coming together again. And it's defined, excuse me, in the dictionary as the process of reestablishing cordial relations as between two countries or two parties, or the state of reconciliation or of cordial relations. So the key elements here are there was a relationship before some conflict occurred, that at least one side feels is worth restoring, and that eventually both sides work to repair. And the process is interpersonal. It takes two people, or two sides, sometimes multiple sides, to do the reconciliation tango. And now we have to consider all that reconciliation is not. Despite the wording on this next slide, it applies to both reconciliation and forgiveness. So what is reconciliation not? Does it change the harm that has been done? No. To reconcile or to forgive does not mean to condone, excuse, justify, rationalize, minimize, forget, or deny that harm. Does reconciliation change the moral responsibility of the perpetrator of that harm? No. If the injured party, the victim, agrees to reconcile with the perpetrator or the perpetrator's group at large, This does not mean that the former has pardoned, excused, or exonerated the perpetrator, nor is the perpetrator thereby absolved of his or her moral responsibility for the harm inflicted. Sorry. Good. Hello, guys upstairs. I need this to show the third part. There. Reconciliation is not forgiveness, although the two processes have much in common, as we will soon see. Understanding these three basic truths is really essential to us, personally and as a society, because confusion over what does and does not constitute reconciliation or forgiveness is itself one of the biggest obstacles to achieving either one. This is because misunderstanding about the moral implications of reconciliation or forgiveness can make too many people reject these processes out of hand as an unacceptable or even unthinkable course of action for them. They often fear, for example, that reconciliation and forgiveness entail more than they are willing to commit to, or more than is morally appropriate. For example, they may fear that forgiveness is tantamount to granting absolution, or that reconciliation requires them to grant forgiveness too. But when we understand that there are limits to each of these processes, limits which many victims should find both morally justified and psychologically helpful, this understanding may then help us open our hearts to appreciating what each can accomplish in our lives. So we've seen that the third truth shown here is that reconciliation is not forgiveness. So now we need to ask, what is forgiveness? And how do the two processes compare? Let's begin with one definition that I found on the website of the Fetzer Institute in Michigan that struck me as very thoughtful and informative. The first part, this definition was written to define forgiveness. However, I believe that every element of this definition also applies to reconciliation, so I've added the words "like reconciliation" in square brackets. So the first part of the definition says, forgiveness, like reconciliation, is a conscious, willful choice to turn away from the pain, hurt, resentment, and wish for revenge that arises from a betrayal, offense, injustice, or deep hurt. Forgiveness, like reconciliation, involves a willingness to accept the past, to see the transgression and transgressor in a larger context, and to replace negative feelings with compassion and tolerance. Forgiveness, like reconciliation, too, can help remove obstacles to the awareness of love's presence in our lives. Now, I experienced the truth of all three parts of this definition when I visited my mother's grave at the age of 44, for only the second time in my life. I finally returned because I had learned to forgive her for leaving me. Once I'd realized that although I had lost a mother, she had lost everything, including life itself. That had triggered in me a flood of compassion for her, and I now know compassion is one major pathway to forgiveness. During my long time at her gravesite, I inwardly asked her for forgiveness for my taking so long to return. And by the end of my visit, I felt as if a boulder had been physically removed from my heart, enabling my love for my mother, which had been driven underground for so long, to flow forth once again. What my experience exemplifies is twofold. First, the psychological potential in forgiveness for transcending deep emotional pain so that we don't remain trapped in our past suffering. And second, the spiritual potential in forgiveness for releasing anger, bitterness, and hatred and replacing them with the virtues of our best self, which include compassion, tolerance, courage, open-heartedness, and love. Now let's take a look at how these two processes are different and where they are similar. So we'll start with the differences. And the first difference is that forgiveness can be given without any contact with the perpetrator. You can do it all by yourself at home. But reconciliation is necessarily interpersonal. That is, both parties, or all the parties involved, participate. And the second difference is that one can forgive someone without reconciling with them. And one can reconcile without forgiving the harm that's been done. To illustrate these two differences, I'll use my own life as an example once again. I forgave my 3 parents fully only after their respective deaths. It took me that long. It took me about 25 years to learn how to do that. So they did not participate directly in this process. Instead, it was a profound shift that took place solely within me. So that makes it clear that we need to distinguish between forgiving someone and communicating that forgiveness to them. These are separate actions, and forgiving does not require that the forgiver inform the person who has been forgiven. It could certainly be very meaningful to do that, but it is not essential to the process. Indeed, sometimes it is impossible. I can also use my own life to explain how we can forgive without reconciling, and vice versa. If one forgives someone only after they have died, as I did with my parents, there can be no reconciliation per se, because the other party is not there to join in the process. So it's an internal process for the forgiver, not an interactive one. Another not uncommon situation where someone might forgive but deliberately avoid a reconciliation with the perpetrator would be, for example, a battered wife or an abused child who does not want to encounter her abuser again, but does want the inner release that forgiveness can bring. And for an example of reconciliation without forgiveness, well, my reconciliation with the German people of today did not involve forgiving anybody for 2 important reasons. First of all, in my interactions with the descendants of the perpetrator generation, which is basically everybody who's alive today in Germany, there was nothing for me to forgive, for they did not commit the sins of the Holocaust. Germans of the descendant generation often say, we are not guilty for what happened in the Holocaust, but we have a responsibility that it not happen again in our country anyway. As for the perpetrator generation itself, I have not forgiven the worst of its members for their crimes, and may never be able to do so, despite the example of a number of Holocaust survivors, as well as other victims of horrific crimes, who have shown that they are capable of forgiving those who have caused their own worst agonies. That's one reason why I no longer regard my non-forgiveness in this context as something that goes without saying, much less something to brag about, like Alan King did on the Johnny Carson show. Rather, I see it as an indication of my own moral limitations. Now, let's consider the similarities between forgiveness and reconciliation. So if we look beneath the box, it turns out that the similarities involve a lot. What makes both processes so difficult? What can make both easier? And what are the rewards, indeed the blessings, that come to us when we accomplish either reconciliation or forgiveness? These similarities are what we will now focus on step by step. We'll start with the obstacles. In trying to understand all the obstacles that might stand between us and reconciliation or forgiveness, we have to recognize that in all too many situations, it can be easier to hate than to love, and easier to deny the humanity in the other than to recognize it. But this melancholy fact makes it all the more important to understand which forces in our own psyches and in society work in this negative way to encourage people to maintain their antagonisms to the other. And I think those forces fall into three basic categories: identity issues, ego issues, and ignorance. So let's take them one by one. I don't have time to discuss that, but now we'll talk about identity issues. Leaving forgiveness aside for a moment, the first obstacle to reconciliation to consider here is the fact that members of a victimized group typically feel a powerful solidarity with one another, a solidarity that is strengthened by their shared victim identity, their shared persecution history, their shared hatred for their oppressors, and a shared sense of grave injustice. As a result, if any members of the victimized group contemplate reconciling with the perpetrator's group, they may hesitate out of the conviction that they would be betraying that solidarity in doing so. Alternatively, they may fear that they would be accused of betraying their own group in seeking any rapprochement at all with one of them. And so they may hold back so as not to jeopardize that valued connection with their own group. This kind of solidarity can be seen in the fact that many Jews to this day cannot conceive of how any other Jew could freely choose to live in Germany, the so-called land of the murderers. Such a choice is viewed as a violation of solidarity with other Jews, and especially with the victims of the Holocaust. But in fact, almost 200,000 Russian Jews have chosen to do so since 1990, as well as thousands of Israelis. The number of Israeli Jews now living just in Berlin, and not just visiting, is estimated to be around 15,000 or more, including one Israeli cousin of mine. An African-American graduate student of mine once gave me another example of how solidarity within a victimized group can block reconciliation. After he heard one of my talks about my experiences in Germany, he said the aversion of some Jews to the idea of reconciling with Germans reminded him of those African Americans who keep themselves apart from so-called white society and from acting white out of solidarity with their victimized group. Another way of looking at how our identities can be an obstacle to reconciliation is to recognize that giving up one's old identity, whether it's a victim identity or some other kind, can be difficult for anyone, regardless of the context, because the old identity provides the comfort and the sense of safety of a familiar perspective, familiar associations, and familiar convictions. We see this difficulty very often. For example, in situations where someone's identity changes when they divorce, when they retire, or when they become an empty nester. As a result, it's natural to want to avoid the kind of birth pains that any significant change in our identity would entail. But getting stuck in an outmoded or overly limiting identity is like locking oneself into an identity cage, a move which may exact a high price in personal freedom and potential for growth. I know this from my own long history of identifying as the motherless child, which was my variation on the theme of victim identity. One day years ago, I was reflecting on the inner costs that I had borne for at least half my life as a result of repeatedly returning to the memory of my past sufferings as a child. After meditating on this theme for a while, I wrote the following in my journal. The victim identity that so many victims naturally assume, but imprudently hold on to at all costs, is a strong barrier to reconciliation because it keeps them focused over and over again on the harm done to them by the other. It's like a freeze frame in their personal history or their group identity, which never gets resolved or transformed. Psychologically, it's never considered healthy or beneficial to remain forever in the role of the widow or the abused or the motherless child, because that just locks one into a life of sorrow or bitterness or perpetual fear of abandonment, and because it's so limiting. We all can have such a breadth of identities and can contribute to our world in so many ways that staying locked into these identity cages is tragic, both for the individual and for the broader society. The trick seems to be in understanding that having had a victim experience does not require us to remain imprisoned in a victim identity forever after. I'm going to read that again. The trick seems to be in understanding that having had a victim experience does not require us to remain imprisoned in a victim identity forever after. The toughest obstacle here may be the fact that forging a new identity requires us to move emotionally and perhaps literally into unfamiliar and as yet unknown territory, like me visiting Germany for my first time. And this can be intimidating or even terrifying. One way to ease such a transition is to look to inspiring role models. However, these are all too often lacking in the sphere of reconciliation and forgiveness, or overshadowed by their opposites. My mother's family had a big reputation for being unforgiving, which was a pity. If we let the news media determine our picture of the world, we are soon inundated by stories of revenge, retaliation, and other means of perpetuating past injustices and historical hatred. For every example of reconciliation or forgiveness that we hear about, we hear countless examples of the opposite. If you think about the news stories you've heard in the last week, you may not be able to remember any that were about reconciliation and forgiveness, but you certainly can remember stories of the opposite going on. Luckily, however, we can discover role models to help us appreciate the value of reconciliation and forgiveness. I have found many in the years when I first went to Germany, but we often have to make the effort to seek them out and then to have the wisdom and the courage to follow their example. Now, beyond these identity issues, another set of obstacles to reconciliation arises from what I call ego issues or ego forces. I don't mean ego in the Freudian sense, but more in the sense of those qualities we sometimes call our human weaknesses or shortcomings or our inner enemies. One major kind of ego-driven emotion that operates as a barrier to reconciliation, especially, more than forgiveness, because one can forgive in total privacy, is simple fear. Fear that non-conciliatory members of our group may ostracize us. Fear that the other may exploit us to alleviate their guilt or for some other self-serving purpose. Fear that our openness to reconciliation will be misinterpreted as a weakness or worse, for example, as condoning, minimizing, or pardoning the real harm that was caused. And fear of feeling vulnerable or unsafe in the company of the other. Fear is always a powerful motivator in human affairs. So when we are deciding whether to move toward a reconciliation, our fears can throw up seemingly insurmountable barriers. Now let's consider what we could call the inner enemies, which are really aspects of our lesser selves. Examples relevant here include self-righteousness, anger, stubbornness, selfishness, shame, impatience, arrogance, and judgmentalness. That's a lot that we carry around, because we all experience these at different times and to different degrees, and they can all be serious obstacles to reaching reconciliation. For example, we may condemn a particular group of perpetrators from a stance of self-righteousness and judgmentalness, without asking ourselves whether we have ever been guilty of even a milder degree of their sin. In this way, we not only maintain the dualistic vision of us versus them, but we may also blind ourselves to the fact that our moral record is not squeaky clean either. For example, we may be the innocent in one context, but the indifferent bystander in another. Of course, this doesn't mean that the peccadillos or minor sins of omission of which you or I might be guilty are at all comparable to major crimes against individuals or even crimes against humanity. Nevertheless, we are all vulnerable to the power of egotistical motivations to blind us to doing the right thing or to following the right path. One relevant example from my own history is my realization that during the many years before 1998, when I saw contemporary Germans as indelibly contaminated by their Nazi history, I was committing a moral injustice by treating today's Germans as responsible for events that happened before they were even born, which was an attitude that made me feel morally superior. That changed, but that's another story. Luckily, however, many of us do try to reduce the effects of these egocentric tendencies in our daily lives. For one thing, by coming to ethical humanist society talks, and by talking with each other, of course. And the more we succeed in reducing these effects, the more open we may become to the moral appeal of reconciliation and forgiveness. Now again, I want to emphasize that I'm using ignorance not in the sense of stupidity, but only in the sense of not yet knowing something. So I'll review these 3 points just briefly here. We may be ignorant about who the other truly is, due to all kinds of reasons, including geographical separation. I had never been to Germany, so I let my anti-German prejudice just flourish. Rampant prejudice, lack of opportunity to interact, the passage of time during which the other may have changed, or paralyzing fears about what-ifs. My own ignorance about how Germany and Germans had changed over time is an example of this obstacle. Another example is the ignorance of many Americans about both Islam and their Muslim neighbors. We also may be ignorant of the rewards to be gained from reconciliation or forgiveness, perhaps because we lack role models in this particular domain, or we lack prior experience of our own. And we may be ignorant of contradictions within our own moral position or our own worldview, like the moral contradictions I discovered when I first took a closer, more honest look at my prejudice against the Germans. So, the more these forces of identity, ego, and ignorance dominate our perspective and control our actions, the more difficult it will be for us to progress toward reconciliation or forgiveness and to reap their rewards. I am happy to report, however, that forces do exist that can support and even facilitate reconciliation, some of which facilitate forgiveness too. So I will talk about those next. For reasons of time, I'll comment on just the first 3 of these right now. namely compassion, motivation, and feeling safe. These actually overlap with the others anyway, and if there's time during the question period, we have the option of returning to this section. I do have the feeling that this section is very important. Although everyone probably has plenty of experience with the obstacles to reconciliation and forgiveness, I believe that most of us would benefit from learning more about the forces that help us to overcome these obstacles. Now, I really wanted to have a chapter in my book that would be called The 3 Secrets of Reconciliation. Compassion, compassion, and compassion. Although I didn't end up with such a chapter title, the role of compassion remains central here. Once we start to feel compassion for the other, we start to dissolve our sense of us versus them, and to recognize just how much we share with the other. This might be shared suffering, shared fears, shared longings, or shared strengths. Whatever it is, seeing how much we have in common can give us the courage to start dismantling the walls we once felt that we needed to build in order to keep them out, or at least far away. One of the most powerful discoveries I made in working on forgiving my stepmother was when I saw that she and I shared about 7 major emotional difficulties, such as a deep-rooted insecurity and a fear of abandonment, most of which were related to the severe losses we had each experienced in life. I had lost my mother very early, but when my stepmother fled Nazi Germany in 1936, at the age of 27, she lost her first true love, all her hopes for higher education, her dream of becoming an architect, her language, and her country. Luckily, by the time I recognized these similarities between us, I had already learned compassion for my own sufferings. That made it remarkably easy to extend that compassion to her as well, because I saw for the first time how alike we had been in all these years, in both our fears and our longings. And I can tell you that before I came to this conclusion, I saw myself as totally different from my stepmother. Totally, I wanted nothing to do with her, and I certainly didn't see us as similar in any way. So learning to feel compassion for the other who has harmed us does not at all preclude practicing compassion for ourselves. In conflict situations, both sides suffer. So we must grant ourselves all the compassion we deserve, without, however, letting it slide into either self-pity or self-righteousness. Naturally, we will never move toward reconciliation or forgiveness without having some strong motivation to take at least the first steps. The sources for our motivation could be religious and or spiritual, psychological, social, and or moral. But in every case, that motivation will be supported if we have the expectation that the effort it takes to reconcile will pay off in some meaningful way at the end. We might hope for a heart cleared of bitterness, a relationship healed of shattered trust, or perhaps just a feeling of greater safety because a major source of inner tension has been removed. In my case, my journey to reconciliation with the Germans of today was guided by my expectation that I would reap the benefit of having my heart freed of the burden of my anti-German prejudice and my victim identity in that regard, just as forgiving my mother had removed a boulder from my heart. But when my Israeli cousin Chagit agreed to travel to Germany for the first time in 1997 as part of an Israeli teacher delegation, the reward she anticipated was different from mine. In a report she published, she explained her motivation for her first trip to Germany this way. I can understand every person who says that he will not visit Germany, who would veto every connection with Germans. But on the other hand, I really think that in the name of remembering and for the sake of not forgetting that horror, it is important that Israelis come and speak with the youth of Germany and tell them about that dark period of their history, because otherwise those who deny the Holocaust will triumph and multiply. So obviously, even in the same family, the motivations for reconciliation may differ greatly. Now, in order to take steps toward reconciliation, we have to feel safe in entering the territory of the other, literally or otherwise, since it was the other who perpetrated the harm in the first place. And when we have built up walls to protect ourselves against having some terrible danger from the past be repeated in the future, we naturally want to have reliable assurances that the danger has finally passed before we are willing to even begin dismantling those walls. It is for this reason that reconciliation will be greatly facilitated by whatever the other side has already done to earn reconciliation. This could take the form of sincerely apologizing, atoning, making amends, paying reparations, or taking any other restorative steps to demonstrate that they are no longer that despised and despicable enemy. These steps provide the victimized party with solid evidence that the other has changed into someone worthy of both trust and reconciliation. Such evidence helps the victim to feel less vulnerable in moving toward reconciliation, as well as to feel more empathy for the other. Although I knew pathetically little about contemporary German when I first set out from my father's hometown in Germany in 1998, I somehow felt safe enough to make that first trip. And one major reason was the connection I had fortuitously established with a high school teacher named Martin Dressler-Schenk of that town, whom my father had met and befriended on a visit 7 years earlier. Time prevents me from explaining all that Martin had done to advance German-Jewish dialogue in that town. But suffice it to say that I now see Martin as the guardian angel who opened the door to Germany for me. Because of his many courageous and warm-hearted initiatives in researching, preserving, and teaching others about the history of the Jews in that town, including the history of my grandfather, Albert Levi, who was the de facto rabbi there from 1910 to 1938. So Martin's good deeds were really the prerequisite for my first trip to Germany, for my connection to him helped me feel not only safe, but welcome. And the trust that my relationship with Martin gave me at the start turned out to be amply justified for the much larger project of exploring Germany, past and present, as I have been doing for decades ever since. As this slide suggests, there are many rewards to reconciliation, and many of these are rewards for forgiveness too. And as the asterisks indicate, most of these are available to both the victim's side and the perpetrator's side. But I want to focus first on the rewards gained by those who reconcile or forgive after having been harmed, that is, the victim or the victim's group, since this is where my own experience lies in regard to my relationship to the German people with whom I have reconciled, and in regard to the family members whom I have forgiven. And, perhaps surprisingly, my own experience suggests that the rewards of both reconciliation and forgiveness are at least as great for those who come from the victim's side as for those who come from the perpetrator's side. Many, if not most, intergroup conflicts don't injure just the actual participants. Instead, they leave a bitter legacy of enduring hostility and a damaged sense of identity that burden descendants on both sides for generations to come. Just think of how the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict is going to affect generations to come. No matter when they stop fighting right now, there will be a terrible legacy for a long time. Such tragic cases are like a tug of war in which each side stubbornly holds on to its end of the historical rope, a rope still vibrating with all the tensions of a mutual antagonism that need not be prolonged indefinitely, but all too often is. What I have come to believe is that when we are caught up in this inherited tug-of-war perspective, and thereby allow past villains to define our present identity, we need to understand that we can exercise the option of escaping from that tug-of-war by learning to let go of our end of the figurative rope in order to step forward into a freer and more promising future. In other words, we can acknowledge the victim experience we have indisputably had, while choosing to leave behind the victim identity that we no longer wish to retain. Indeed, this is why the original title for my book was Setting the Heart Free, the liberating power of forgiveness and reconciliation. And this liberating force, this remarkable release, is available not just to descendants of victims who, like me, are a generation or more removed from the evil perpetrated earlier, as in the case of the Holocaust. It is also available to victims whose hearts have been broken a very short time ago. I learned this most dramatically when I attended a talk in Chicago on reconciliation and spirituality, given by Robert Schreiter, a theology professor and Catholic lay worker who has carried out a reconciliation ministry in war-torn places like Rwanda and Kosovo. He told his rapt audience this true story. At the South African Truth and Reconciliation hearings, a man appeared asking for amnesty for at least 2 murders. One of his victims, a woman whose husband and son had both been killed by this man, appeared there at the same time to give her own testimony. When asked by the magistrate, "What do you want the government to do with this man?" she answered, "I want this man to come to my house once every month so I can cook for him and feed him and give him the little love that is still in my heart." After saying this, she went and embraced him, whereupon he fainted. I have thought long and hard about what could possibly have motivated this woman's remarkable invitation. And I realized that it was in deep accord with my own growing understanding about the rewards of reconciliation and forgiveness. That is, I have learned that those victims who can reconcile or forgive often do so out of some inner wisdom that recognizes how essential it is to keep their own love flowing freely, instead of walling it up to defend against past and future pain. They may know this from their own prior experience, from religious teachings, or just some blessed instinct. But wherever that liberating impulse comes from, such people discover that their own post-conflict salvation lies in choosing love over hate, and in choosing the goodness and generosity of their own best selves in place of the bitterness and sorrow of victim identity. In many cases, they recognize that doing so is a far more fitting way to honor the values of the loved ones they've lost. And they find a welcome strength in knowing that they have deliberately refused to stoop to the level of those who have harmed them. This must certainly have been true for those parishioners of the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, who publicly forgave the young man who murdered their loved ones in 2015. And it may well have been a motivation for Erica Kirk, the wife of Charlie Kirk, who publicly forgave his killer barely 2 months ago. Another reward that can emerge from the reconciliation process is the opportunity to transmute one's own past pain into future justice, and thereby contribute to the moral obligation that Jews call tikkun olam, or the repair of the world. I have in mind individuals who have not only reconciled with those who have done them harm, but who have continued to pursue a path of active involvement directed toward helping others, especially younger generations, to learn the necessary lessons that would reduce the odds of such harm being repeated in the future. In the case of German-born Jews who have survived the Holocaust, many have not only personally reconciled with the German people of today, but have subsequently volunteered their time and energy to participate in Holocaust education, both at home and in Germany. Their goal has been to help future generations to be better equipped to guard against the kinds of prejudice, conformity, discrimination, and marginalization of minorities that helped to make the Holocaust possible. In this way, they build on their own experiences of post-conflict reconciliation to help save the children of the future from having to suffer what the children of the Holocaust had to endure. Now I want to say a few words about some of the rewards that are available to both parties to a reconciliation, some of which also applies to those who forgive. The first reward, of course, is that we restore a relationship that we cared enough about to put in the hard work that reconciliation requires. Another great reward of reconciliation and forgiveness is that they enable us to reclaim a more positive identity by moving forward to more fully realize our better self. One way we can do this is by working to subdue all those obstructive ego forces, like selfishness and judgmentalness, that separate us from the other. And they don't do us so many favors either. At the same time, we can work to strengthen our compassion and empathy for the other, to develop more humility and self-awareness, and to practice maintaining a more open and more loving heart. These steps not only facilitate progress toward reconciliation or forgiveness, but they also bring out and strengthen our own best qualities. And whether one is secular or religious, this is an objective of the highest value. Those who can achieve a successful reconciliation, or who can forgive, are also rewarded by the greater freedom that it makes possible. That freedom arises in part because when we can let go of past pains, of our victim identity, of barriers that have divided us from the other, we free up a great amount of psychic energy with which we can now pursue greater goals. In addition, we find greater freedom because the world in which we now feel safe to live our lives has been enlarged. I certainly now enjoy a greater personal freedom because my friendship circles no longer exclude Germans. And in fact, my life has been profoundly enriched by the friendships I have made with Germans, including with two men whose close relatives were significant Nazi perpetrators. And they too have gained immeasurably from their commitment to pursuing German-Jewish dialogue and reconciliation, despite all the challenges and burdens of coming from the perpetrator's side. Finally, reconciliation, like forgiveness, can reward us with the freedom that comes from newly expanded horizons. When I first went to Germany in 1998, I had no idea that this 6-day trip would unfold into an adventure spanning more than 2 decades, that it would lead me to immerse myself in the inspiring study of both reconciliation and forgiveness, that it would provide the scaffolding for a major period in my own growth and moral development, or that it would introduce me to a host of fascinating authors and teachers of every sort who share my concerns and deepest values. But by taking those first steps out of the confines of my unexamined anti-German prejudice, I unwittingly opened a door that ultimately led me to a degree of inner and outer freedom that I would never have anticipated. So thank you for your patience and attention, and now I'll be glad to answer questions. You go.
Thank you so much, Judith, for that moving and open reflection and talk, and I look forward to our conversation in the Q&A. So we'll have a musical interlude now while you can start thinking about your questions. And during the musical interlude, we invite you to donate to the Ethical Humanist Society. It is through our generosity that we show how meaningful these Sunday programs are. A donation of $5 to $10 or any amount that you're comfortable with is greatly appreciated. Contributions can be made at our website, or you can scan the QR code, and we'll also pass the basket for those of you who are in person. Thank you to everyone who sustains the society through your donations of time and money. All right, we now invite questions from the audience. Please come to the microphone over there to ask your question. And we've already got a number of people in line, so please just remember to keep your questions brief. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. It was great. But I wanted to return, and I apologize in advance because this is sort of a scattershot question, but I hope.
Can you talk closer to the mic, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
So early on in the talk, you bring up the example of the Jewish comedian, I forget his name, Alan King or something, on Johnny Carson, and how he was.
I'm sorry, I'm getting older, and my hearing is too. So.
Okay. So you brought up the example early on of the comedian on Johnny Carson and how he was.
Johnny Carson.
Is this not working? I don't know how to.
My ears aren't working so well, so.
Okay. So you brought up the example of the comedian on Johnny Carson who was essentially proud of his lack of forgiveness, right? And you made somewhat offhanded comment about how anyone who would be proud to not show, say, generosity or kindness would be sort of obviously unethical in some way or another. Well, I think that's generally true. I think there's also clearly bounds on generosity, on kindness, right? I think anyone in this room could think of plenty of groups or people that they are, if not proud, at least honestly, or happy to not be generous with. Like, there's groups that I would never want to give money to, for instance, that I think are actively doing harm, right?
They are groups that you would never give money to.
Yeah, I'm saying there's bounds to generosity, there's bounds to kindness, and I guess my question is, how do you, when it comes to forgiveness and reconciliation, are there bounds to when that's appropriate, and can you find limits where it could actively do harm? Generosity to the wrong people can cause harm, just like reconciliation, perhaps with someone who's actively trying to do harm, could be destructive. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that perspective, if that makes sense.
That's a great question. And really important to think about, and has no simple answer, as you can imagine. Remember that reconciliation has the purpose of restoring a relationship that both sides want to restore. But there are relationships that one is very glad to be done with, where reconciliation doesn't make sense. It's not coherent, it's not beneficial. So I don't know what you have in mind, but several people have asked me when they heard I was going to be giving this talk, oh, are you going to teach us how to forgive Trump and his cronies, for example? I don't know if that's what you had in mind. But I did give an example of cases where one can forgive for one's own sake in private. For example, a battered wife or an abused child who does not want to reconcile, does not want any connection to the perpetrator. And that sounds like a good choice to me. So I'm not saying that you should always reconcile or you should always forgive. There definitely are bounds. There are contexts. There's discrimination in the positive sense of making a distinction between which relationship is worth restoring and which is not. I've had friends who were very good friends who then changed in some way and became someone I did not want to spend time with. And I did not work on reconciling with them because that new relationship I would have had would not have been fulfilling or beneficial to me. Now, I'll just anticipate maybe some other questions. For example, about forgiving the Nazi perpetrators. There are Holocaust survivors of concentration camps, who have forgiven Nazi doctors. They are not large in number, and they have not. There's a woman named Eva Kor, I didn't have time to talk about her, who was, she and her twin sister were experimented on in Auschwitz. And she went on to discover that by forgiving the Nazi doctors, she met with one to find out more about what had gone on. And then she decided to forgive him. She felt that gave her power. When you're a victim, you don't have power. When you're a victim, you don't have power. But she said, when you decide whether or not to forgive, then you have power. And she urged people to forgive their worst enemies. I found that was overdoing it. I've heard her give a talk also that she really urged people, and I think with good motivation. The motivation was so that people could experience the liberating power that is inherent in forgiving. But I don't think that means we should forgive everybody or every harm done. So there's a big continuum of little harms going to atrocities and the Holocaust and genocide. So we can practice forgiving in between there without having to wonder, do I have to forgive those people too? You know, there's a lot of other cases where it would benefit us to open our hearts in one way or another, but not in every case.
Thanks for your talk. I had a question about forgiveness specifically, and to get the benefit of forgiveness for yourself, it seems like, at least to me, the compassion pathway seems very promising, and that's doable for me for other people, and and even people who are doing bad things, I can understand where they're coming from, but hard for more abstract entities like corporations that are doing harm, or I don't know, like just bad constructs in society. And I was wondering if you have any advice, if you're consumed with rage about corporate malfeasance, what do you do to find compassion or forgiveness for those things? Just for your own personal benefit, not that they deserve it.
Oh, I haven't thought about corporations and forgiveness. I certainly have thought about corporations and rage. Let me see. You know, sometimes the rage is fully justified because of the harm that's being done. And again, as let's see if I can find it. Just a minute.
It's not showing up there.
Oh, it's not showing up. Oh, hello. They went home, but it'll remind me. So I said, does reconciliation change the moral responsibility of the perpetrator of that harm? No. And to forgive does not mean to condone, excuse, justify, rationalize, minimize, forget, or deny that harm. And maybe when you see that harm, it can motivate you to take action, to be a social activist, or to demonstrate, or, I mean, it's hard to figure out, given how much power that corporations have in our society and around the world. So I would say there are other directions we can go in without worrying about, do I have to forgive a corporation, or what does it even mean to forgive a corporation? But a corporation consists of people making decisions. So it just reminds me the power of good company. Better you should hang out with people who have good values than people who destroy the earth, for example. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think there were some indirect allusions, I think, to what you were talking
Please
about.
come to the mic closer.
Okay. But there's another word that I think needs to be introduced here that seems to me a prerequisite for both forgiveness and reconciliation, and that's accountability. And that's something that, of the Holocaust, there's somewhat belated accountability there. The international community recognizes the Holocaust, and there were the Nuremberg trials. South Africa had their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but truth was an inherent part of reconciliation. Rwanda had their Gakaka courts, so some pronunciation, something like that, based on their traditional practices. And today there are perpetrators and victims living side by side in Rwanda. So I'm looking at these things, and certainly in the Middle East, we brought that up too. The communities are already so intertwined, but if there's to be reconciliation at some point, it would seem that there has to be accountability for the sins committed. So I guess I want to put that word in there. Isn't accountability a prerequisite for any of this to happen?
Is accountability a prerequisite for reconciliation?
Forgiveness and reconciliation, I would think. In other words, if you feel like the people got away with it, it seems like you can't make any progress past that.
At the end of the question and answer session, you will be given some marvelous quotes that I have assembled on reconciliation and forgiveness. And they include some quotes that address this issue. So, for example, Desmond Tutu, who wrote a book called No Future Without Forgiveness, says, in forgiving, people are not being asked to forget. On the contrary, it is important to remember so that we should not let such atrocities happen again. Forgiveness does not mean condoning what has been done. And it's longer, but you can read it when you take it home. Forgiving means abandoning your right to pay back the perpetrator in his own coin, but it is a loss that liberates the victim. I also want to tell you about this wonderful book called Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, Facing History After Genocide and Mass Violence. It's by Martha Minow, M-I-N-O-W. And she's a law professor. And this book is all about how societies struggle with the issues of accountability. And she points out that societies can respond to mass violence or the atrocities with vengeance. At the other end, they can respond with forgiveness. So she puts it as a sort of continuum. But most countries neither remain in a vengeful mode, nor do they rush to forgive the perpetrators or their enemies, the other side. Instead, they try to find some way of satisfying the demands of justice, which I think is close to what you mean by accountability. Is that fair to say? Yeah. A commitment to justice and accountability, but wanting to move beyond dwelling in the past to create a more fulfilling future. And she has her chapter 2 is called Vengeance and Forgiveness, but it discusses the pros and cons of vengeance, the pros and cons of forgiveness, and the pros and cons of 3 different ways that societies have chosen in the 20th century to deal with mass violence. One is trials, like the Nuremberg trial, and many Nazis escaped prosecution. Some of the highest ones were prosecuted and executed, but many Nazis were not held to account. Then she talks about truth commissions, like the one in South Africa, which accomplished a lot. And Desmond Tutu's book discusses that at great length. So you might be interested in reading his book. And then there's reparations, which Germany has paid. Germany has paid billions of dollars to individual victims of the Holocaust under certain conditions, and to the state of Israel. And there are pros, and it's interesting, you'd think that each of these, well, these sound very good, but it turns out that some of them do better. Well, for example, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, the people who came, like that man who came to admit to the murders he committed, he was given amnesty afterwards. And some people think that's terrible. But on the other hand, in South Africa, the whites and the blacks had to go on living together. So apparently the post-apartheid regime decided that this was the best way they could think of, despite the disadvantages, to proceed. On the other hand, Jews who survived the Holocaust could leave Germany and go live in Australia or the United States or Israel, wherever they wanted to. They didn't have to lay eyes on another German ever again. They didn't have to buy a German car. They didn't have to have anything to do with Germans. So the urgency to reconcile was minimized in that case. So one of the, it's not showing up. It is showing up now? Oh, goody, thank you guys. What I didn't have time to talk about was variation in reconciliation experiences. So before what I'm calling the troubles start, they vary a lot in scale, depth, and duration. While they go on, they vary a lot. And then afterwards, the contexts are different. So they can vary in urgency, the paths they take, which is what Minnow talks about, or the outcomes. The outcomes sometimes are good, sometimes they are mixed. Not everybody feels that what's going on in Rwanda is as nice as the government would like to make us think. So it's very complicated. So I've just begun to address your question. But I really recommend this book by Martha Minnow, Between Vengeance and Forgiveness. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. It has been very revealing. My question was with regards to the amount of separation that is required between the troubles, as you mentioned here, and the actual time of reconciliation and forgiveness. So I think you mentioned it as part of the safety part of it, but for example, you don't want the Ukrainians to be forgiving Russians right now while the active conflict is going on. That is not the situation that you're talking about. There is some amount of separation that is needed between the trouble and the reconciliation and forgiveness.
Another very good question. It turns out that it's much easier for me to go to who has not been involved in the Holocaust, who was not in Europe. I was born in 1944, so in New York. So it's easier for me to reconcile with the descendants of the perpetrators, but that doesn't mean that everybody has to wait. And I brought some information about Israelis and Palestinians who have been working for years, despite the conflicts and the wars that have been going on. For example, I saw a film, actually this was a while ago, called Counterpoint, and they listed in their credits close to 100 local organizations that were contributing to getting Jews and Palestinians together to, I'm not sure the word would be reconciled, to recognize the humanity in the other, to understand the other's position, and to build bridges that could be built upon eventually when hostilities stopped. And I want to, so while I was working on this chapter in the book, it turns out that a pair of speakers came and spoke at Beth Emet Synagogue in Evanston. And one was a woman whose son, and her son was a peace activist. He was among 9 soldiers killed by a sniper in a Palestinian ambush. And the man, his 62-year-old father, Palestinian, was shot by Israeli soldiers after breaking a curfew in order to buy groceries for his family in a refugee camp. These two had been brought together by a remarkable, let's call it a bridge-building group between Palestinians and Jews in Israel. And they go around talking about why it's important not to wait for the end of hostilities in order to build bridges. And let me just read, can I read a little bit? To develop this framework, the group provides pairs of speakers, one Palestinian, one Israeli Jew, who visit classrooms and community centers in both communities to speak about how their experiences of loss have motivated them to come together to do this reconciliation work. As of this writing, and this was like 15 years ago when I wrote this, close to 7,000 such dialogue meetings have been held for audiences totaling more than 200,000. They also support a women's group, a peace and reconciliation camp for youth, a joint Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Day celebration, the ceremony, I should say, art exhibitions, and much more. Listen to this. This is what I really wanted to share. One project in years past was called A Crack in the Wall. Among the innovative steps it took to foster dialogue were the installation of a toll-free phone line for frank Palestinian-Israeli conversations, which totaled over 1 million, and the posting of relevant discussion questions on social media. Excuse me. So that anyone could respond anonymously or otherwise, and all posts were made available in both Arabic and Hebrew, which is really important. The mottos of this group, Parents Circle Families Forum, include, "It will not stop until we talk," and, I love this one, "Better the pains of peace than the agonies of war," as well as, "If we can reconcile, anyone can." So I find that very encouraging to know that you don't have to wait. Thank God. Yeah. Before Carrie takes over, I want to say, if you like this talk or you would like to share it with anybody who you think would be interested, please let them know that it's on your wonderful YouTube channel. And also be sure that there are 2 handouts. One has quotes that are really juicy. I really urge you to sit with them, and they will answer some of the questions that came up, as a matter of fact. And the other one is books on forgiveness and reconciliation that I recommend. So the details of this one are there, among others.
Sorry for having to send some of you questioners back to your seats, but Judith did express interest in sticking around for the coffee hour, so you can continue the conversation then. And thank you again, Judith. And that's it. Thank you all for attending today, and please stick around for our coffee hour.